This week on Tragic Hollywood on the Town, we're going to profile the tragic John Garfield. My channel is 100% me, no AI images, no AI voice. Thanks for joining me, and let's look at John Garfield and his sad life. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tragic Hollywood Star of the Week. This week's star is John Garfield. John Garfield is unique in that he was the largest star of the 1950s to be sacrificed on McCarthy's altar of anti-communism witch hunt, whatever you want to call it, the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings that ruined many, many careers in Hollywood, notably mostly writers, because you can't trust those commie writers. But Garfield also became a casualty of these hearings. I'd always maintained that it wasn't illegal to be a communist, because how can you make a political party illegal in a country where you're supposed to have freedom to believe and to do what you want with it, as long as it's within the law and doesn't hurt anybody. But apparently they did make communism illegal and being a member of the Communist Party illegal at that time. There was no proof that Garfield was ever a communist, and we'll get into that later. But he was the largest star to be sacrificed on the communist altar. Anyway, he was born John Julius Garfinkel in 1913 in Brooklyn, New York. His mother died a couple of years after she had his younger brother, Max. Apparently, she never recovered from that birth. And his father just simply farmed these two boys out to relatives throughout the boroughs of Brooklyn. And that's where he grew up, on the streets of Brooklyn. So he grew up as kind of a tough kid, but he also grew up with a love of the arts and a love of drama. And eventually this led him to the theater. And eventually it led him to becoming a member of the very prestigious theater group in New York called The Group. The Group, or what remained of it after the McCarthy era, became the Actors Studio. And but it was membership in this theater group that would come back to haunt John Garfield later on. He honed his acting chops on Broadway in this theater group, and he was noticed for his talent and his grit. It was sort of the first time people saw realistic acting on that scale. I'm not saying that John Garfield was the only one. This group, the Group, sort of pioneered the method acting that would become so popular in the late 50s and 60s and continues actually to this day. That style of realistic, gritty acting over the stylized, kind of overdramatic, unrealistic acting that came out of Hollywood's earliest days and continued through the 30s and 40s. So he was pretty special, and he got noticed right away. He was also really handsome. So I'm going to read this section of the biography because I have a hard time paraphrasing it. Garfield made his Broadway debut in 1932 in a play called The Lost Boy. It ran for 2 weeks, but gave Garfield something critically important for an actor struggling to break into the theater. And this next part is from my book. From the book, Tragic Hollywood, Beautiful, Glamorous, and Still Dead. Julius was initially given small roles in group productions and soon worked his way up to supporting roles. Even before this, he had gotten the attention of Warner Brothers in a civic repertoire play called Lost Boys. He was offered a contract at that time, but turned it down because F Hollywood. He wasn't going to be a cog in a wheel of mediocrity on celluloid. He was better than that. He didn't even ask how much dirty money he had turned away. This was John Garfield. He was marvelous in his first showcase role in Clifford Odets' rousing socialist work of art, Waiting for Lefty. And he continued to hone his acting chops. Now, Garfield was haunted by one of Odets' plays. It was called Golden Boy. And he was angry when the group theater troupe chose someone else to star in Golden Boy because Odette had said he based the character the main character in Golden Boy on John Garfield, who had been an amateur boxer. And so Garfield assumed he was going to be allowed to play this role, but they gave it to someone else. This angered John Garfield. And when Warner Brothers agreed to allow him time off from acting to pursue his stage work, he agreed to sign a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers, and the group was all up in arms and viewed this as a betrayal of their values. They were never going to sell out to Hollywood. Yeah, okay. Why didn't you give him the part that he wanted then? And shockingly enough, later on in his career, Warner Brothers would make a film based on Golden Boy. And guess what? John Garfield didn't get that part either. It went to this unknown guy who nobody had ever heard of before that point, named William Holden. Well, of course, that movie made William Holden a well-known star after that. He didn't do so well initially, but when he finally received a role in a film called Four Daughters, he sort of stole the picture, and he was off and running, and he was all of a sudden the hottest thing. And he really was. It's hard to underestimate how big this guy was at that time, how much excitement surrounded him, because he was such a unique person. He was such a unique actor, and his style of acting was considered very unique, provocative, sexy, passionate. And so he received Academy Award nomination for this role. And so he was kind of off and running with this film. I'm going to read you a little passage from my book, Tragic Hollywood, Beautiful, Glamorous, and Still Dead, in his chapter. Four Daughters' success must have blindsided him. Not only was the film a smash, much of his triumph was attributed to the edgy newcomer, John Garfield. The critics ran out of superlatives and began tripping over themselves in praise of the performance as the find of the decade. The performance as the find of the decade. Today, it's hard to imagine the level of excitement Garfield instilled in people in those first years, and how far from his pinnacle of grace he would eventually fall. But of course, the honeymoon with Warner Brothers was short-lived, because Garfield had integrity, and he knew that he didn't want to be just another pretty face in crowd-pleasing B pictures. He wanted real roles, showcasing real emotions and real people. And at that time, Warner Brothers wasn't really keen on that kind of movie if they didn't think it could make money. And that was usually the case. The audience wanted thrillers or melodramas or love stories, but they weren't really interested in real stories about real people or realistic. This was sort of an ahead of its time concept. It would come into being much later, much too late for John Garfield. But he he became kind of bittersweet with Warner Brothers, and kind of conflicted about his choice to become a star and leave the group theater. Of course, one of his most famous roles was The Postman Always Rings Twice with Lana Turner, one of the best film noirs ever made. Warner Brothers was the master of film noirs, commercial film noirs at any rate. And The Postman Always Rings Twice was a phenomenal film. Turner was at her most beautiful and alluring, and she paired well with John Garfield. They seemed to have a spark between them, even though in real life I don't even think they liked each other very much, but they sure did sizzle on film. This movie pushed the boundaries for the censors as well, and was really, and had an ending that no one saw coming. And, in those days, everything ended happily, but this is not end happily. And this was shocking to audiences. It was ahead of its time. It's still watched today, and it's still held up as one of the best film noirs that was ever made. And John Garfield is pretty much at the peak of his career when he makes this movie. He also made Humoresque with Joan Crawford, which was very successful, and another film called Gentleman's Agreement. And the reason he made Gentleman's Agreement was he believed very strongly in the message of anti-Semitism that was coming from this film. He was Jewish, and the Nazis were rampaging through Europe, and this movie was close to his heart, and that's why he chose to make that film. So he was still trying to hang on to his integrity and his principles, and then everything just sort of went to crap for John Garfield. I'm going to read this passage from my book, Tragic Hollywood, Beautiful, Glamorous, and Still Dead. The tragedy struck the Garfield home. Their first child, Kathy, had been born with asthma, and Robbie had struggled with the child's attacks for most of her life. Robbie was John Garfield's wife. She was also a member of the group. In March of 1945, Kathy was sent to the ranch of a family friend in Vista, California for a holiday. The nanny, Miss Wayne, was sent with the girl and allowed her to play in the hay at the ranch all day. I know what it's like to have allergy-induced asthma. That evening, the girl was in distress. Her throat was swollen, and she was wheezing. By morning, she was gasping, and the nanny took her back home to Beverly Hills instead of to a doctor. By the time Kathy arrived back home, she was almost dead, and instead of taking her to the hospital right away, Robbie called the pediatrician and then tried to treat the attack, as she had done countless times before with home remedies. It didn't work. John Garfield's only daughter died before he was able to get home to say goodbye. She was 6 years old. Garfield was inconsolable, and a gloom descended on him that would darken the rest of his days. And this was just the first in a series of things that happened to John Garfield that ended up in his own death. One of the last films he made for Warner Brothers was a film called Body and Soul, and he wanted to make this film as sort of a compensation prize for not getting Golden Boy, because it's about a boxer. And he decided, by God, he's going to make a film about a boxer if it kills him, And so he made this film, Body and Soul. He was essentially playing himself in this film. And the film did moderately well. It did pretty well. And so you could say Garfield was doing well with his career. And then the House Un-American Activities Committee got wind of this commie movie star who had once been a part of this commie theater group that everybody knew were full of a bunch of communists. And we can't have this in Hollywood, and we're going to drag his ass before the hearings committee, and we're going to get him to name names and write out more actors, and he's going to, this is going to be not tolerated in red, white, and blue America, because this was at the heights of the Red Scare after World War II, and all of a sudden the Russians went from being our allies to our stark enemies, and the race for the atomic bomb, for them to get an atomic bomb, and all of this stuff. So yeah, there was a lot of anti-communist fear in this country, and this fear was palpable, and it lasted from the early 50s until I'd say the early 80s. I can still remember when I was a kid in school trying to duck and cover under my desk in case there was a nuclear bomb explosion somewhere. That was scary. I mean, they made us literally duck under our desks. Not because of school shooters. We didn't have those. We were always worried somebody's going to drop a bomb, an atomic bomb somewhere. And our only, if we happened to be at school, our only cover would be our stupid, flimsy, fake wood desks, I guess. Yeah. The interesting thing about Body and Soul is that nearly everyone who worked on it, all the writers, directors, all ended up their careers smashed on the altar of the House Un-American Activities Committee. All of them. And that's sad. But it was a smash hit, and Garfield earned a second Academy Award nomination for that role. He didn't win, but he earned a second Academy Award nomination, which he coveted. He had had 2 heart attacks up to this point. This is 1947. He had had 2 heart attacks up to this point. He had had rheumatic fever or scarlet fever when he was a child, which had damaged his heart. And the doctors had warned him to take it easy, that stress and his unfortunate habit, chain smoking habit, were putting undue stress on his already compromised heart. But he didn't listen, and he continued with his frenetic pace. And then, of course, when the House Un-American Activities Committee came after him and his career looked like it was over, again, that was going to put tremendous amount of stress and pressure on his heart with devastating results. I'm going to read to you a chapter in my book, Tragic Hollywood, Beautiful, Glamorous, and Still Dead, regarding this time period in Garfield's life. Julius and most of the old friends were targets. The entire group theater were heavily socialist, if not outright communist. After all, it was unbridled capitalism that had been the root cause of the Great Depression and the complete collapse of the world's economy. Many people were slightly fed up with the status quo and looking for change. Robbie had never been shy about her political leanings and proudly flashed her communist card like a badge of honor. Oops. Many of his writer friends, you know those writers, like I said in the beginning, were communists. He and Robbie had actually accepted an invitation to dinner given by a genuine communist, a Russian journalist, which was held aboard a Soviet freighter docked in LA Harbor. Gasp. The fact that the journalist had been invited by the U.S. State Department and that the dinner had been arranged by the U.S. State Department did not matter to the HUAC, who brushed such pesky facts aside and frequently in their zest to root out Reds. John Garfield was doomed, a victim of his unwavering integrity and his own government's stupidity. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was grilled about others in the film industry. He did refuse to name names. As far as I know, he refused to name names and claimed he didn't know anyone who was a communist. But he did reject communism publicly, because essentially if he didn't, his career would be over. Unfortunately, this didn't save his career. Hollywood gambled that he wasn't so big that they would be that hurt if they cut him loose, but he was big enough to please Joseph McCarthy and the committee. Who were chomping at the bit and, hungry for a major star to be sacrificed on their altar of communism, rooting out communism. So, yeah. Anyway, his career was over at that point. And he couldn't even go back to the theater group because they viewed him as a traitor he said he was a sucker for a left hook. That's a reference to his boxing movies. He rejected communism publicly, and they even wrote an article about it, but it was not published. But everyone got wind of what was in it, and so he was persona non grata with both communists and the group and Hollywood. So he was kind of cut loose from everything. That's pretty sad. John Garfield was facing divorce, possible indictment by the federal government for perjury, and his career was over. He moved out of the apartment that he and Robbie shared on May 9th, and he indicated that there was an impending divorce. His closest friends, he told that to. I'm not sure. I think he probably was living in a hotel, but I do know one thing, that he went to the actress Iris Whitney's apartment in Gramercy Park. And Gramercy Park is a whole story unto itself. It's a little Victorian enclave in Manhattan full of Victorian apartment buildings from the turn of the last century, and it's beautiful. And in the middle of it all is a little park called Gramercy Park, and you can't get into that park unless you have a key. I know because I tried. I actually filmed where John Garfield died, and I filmed all around the park, and I filmed through the bars so you can actually see inside the park. There's a statue of Edwin Booth in the park that's been there since the park and the neighborhood were built. And Edwin Booth was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln. But he was a very famous actor. John Wilkes Booth came from a famous acting family. Edwin Booth was a famous stage actor of his time. And so John Garfield sat on a bench and stared at this statue for a long time. He complained to Iris that he wasn't feeling very well. He had played several rounds of golf that morning. Didn't seem to me like he was slowing down much. He was complaining of feeling tired and ill. So she took him to her apartment, and they had a little bit of a dinner, and she put him to bed. And on the morning of May 21st, there was an interesting scene happening at Iris Whitney's apartment. She had called police to let them know there was something going on in the apartment, but when they tried to get into the apartment, she was hysterical. She thought they were reporters. I don't think she was all there at that point, and she refused to let them in. She kept screaming, "I'm not going to let any effing reporters in here." They kept telling her who they were, but she wasn't buying it. She was just sort of gone at that point, kind of in shock, I think, because that morning she had gone into the bedroom to wake John Garfield, and he was stone cold dead. He died of a massive, massive heart attack. He was only 39 years old. I think the cops used a crowbar to force their way in, finally, for this, just to find John Garfield dead at the age of 39. Like I said, he was facing a lot of challenges, expensive divorce, probable actual indictment for perjury charges, for perjuring himself, supposedly lying about his association with communism at the hearings for the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was living on borrowed time, actually, since his heart had been damaged when he was a child, and he really never took care of it. He should never have taken up smoking, for one thing. That's really bad. Even though back then they didn't think it was as bad as they know it is now. At any rate, that's the sad story of John Garfield. He could have done so much. He was cut down during the prime of his life. He could have made many more movies, but he was a victim of stupidity and prejudice and ignorance, essentially. Kind of like maybe what's happening today for a lot of people. It's sad that we haven't progressed any further, but I'm not going to get political. Thank you so much. Please, John Garfield is in my book, Tragic Hollywood, Beautiful, Glamorous, and Still Dead. It's the blue cover. All of my books are available on Amazon.com. There's a link to my author page in the description of this channel if you want to take a closer look at my books. I think they're pretty good. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next week.